Today I'm continuing with my series on a gospel development theory that is represented in the works of Dr. Craig Keener about the Pharisees and Jesus' engagement with the Pharisees in the Gospels. The development theory in question, as I illustrated by reading some quotations last time from Dr. Keener's work, is that Matthew engages with Pharisaism more than either Mark or Luke, and that John does so more than Matthew, and that this represents a chronological progression in which these authors, and I read you some examples specifically concerning John, replaced other types of religious leaders with Pharisees and changed the facts, even though he doesn't use that word. He uses the phrase updated language, but that's a misleading phrase. I'm not saying he knew it was misleading, but it is objectively misleading. Changed the facts, made the controversies concerning the religious leaders focus on the Pharisees when the authors had no reason to think that it actually was the Pharisees, or even knew that it wasn't the Pharisees, or were even inventing an incident that didn't happen, in order to make their Gospels more relevant to their readers, because their readers were suffering from the Pharisees after the fall of Jerusalem, after 70 A.D. And I promised that I would be showing that this is just completely false, even at the level of, who has the most engagement with Pharisaism among the Gospels. It's actually Luke, far more than John, and a little bit more than Matthew. I'm not making anything of that. I'm not saying that I think there's a developmental thesis and Luke has to be later, because I believe the development theories of the Gospels are all bunk. I think the authors are recording these things because they happened. Yes, they happened in this way. If they say that it was Pharisees, that's because they actually think it was Pharisees. They actually believe they have good reason to believe it was Pharisees. They actually know that it was Pharisees, not because they're changing it from the priests to the Pharisees, because that'll make it more relatable to their readers. All right, so today I'm talking specifically about rules controversies. Don't worry, I'll get to other controversies with the Pharisees later. I am not cherry picking. I am trying to cover all sorts of different data points here so that you can see that this development thesis is just wildly false. It's just completely inaccurate, even as a description of the data. Even aside from the alleged explanation. So what I mean by rules controversies is that Jesus is coming into conflict with the Pharisees, or plausibly the Pharisees. In one case, I'm even allowing one to be counted in John where it doesn't even mention the Pharisees, since me being generous to Dr. Keener's thesis, over specific traditions of men. Rules that they have that are not necessarily God's rules, and then they're coming and shaking a finger at Jesus or his disciples because he's not following these. And I'm going to give you the short version now. So if you want to click stop, I hope not. I hope you'll listen to the whole video. But if you just want to hear the short version, here's the short version. There are 5 rules controversies with the Pharisees shared among 2 or more synoptic gospels, where that incident is told in 2 or more synoptic gospels. There are 2 that are unique to Luke. There is a third one that could be regarded as unique to Luke, but I'm just going to kind of treat it as if it kind of cross-cancels with a very similar one that I think is a different incident that's found in Mark and Matthew. So I'm going to count it as 7 total rules controversies in the synoptics, with Luke having all of the ones that are in Matthew and or Mark, and 2 additional ones. Okay? 7 in Luke, 5 in the others, or in Luke with the others, that is to say. So when you count the total, Luke has the most, and, drum roll, 2 in John. And for one of those, he doesn't even use the word Pharisees, just two. So from the perspective of rules controversies, this idea that Matthew engages with Pharisaism more than either Mark or Luke, I read you that quote last time, Dr. Kinder says that, and that John, then there's more of this emphasizing the authority of the Pharisees in John, is false. Okay, very false. Now just a few details. All right, I'm going to start with the rules controversies that are shared, reported in 2 or more of the Synoptic Gospels. Eating with tax collectors and sinners. This is found in all 3, sometimes called triple tradition. It's after the call of Matthew/Levi. There's a feast, and then the Pharisees come and criticize him for eating with tax collectors and sinners. Okay, next one. The disciples picking and rubbing grain on the Sabbath. It is in all of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the word Pharisees is used in all 3. That the Pharisees come in and they kind of jump out of the corn stalks or whatever and say, hey, your disciples are working on the Sabbath. So again, we're going to talk about emphasizing the authority of the Pharisees. They are definitely portrayed as those who are sort of the morality police, okay, on these rules. All right, third, man with a withered hand. It is the Pharisees in all 3. So it's in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. Scribes and Pharisees is sometimes used, but all 3 at least include the Pharisees. I'm even going to mention this later. I'll just mention it quickly now. After the man with the withered hand story, Mark, allegedly, the earliest gospel, says that the Pharisees went out and took counsel with the Herodians, who were a different group, as to how they might destroy Jesus. So we want to talk about, persecution, assumption of power, and assumption of authority, involvement in plotting to kill Jesus. Mark uniquely has this statement after the man with withered hand incident. All right, not washing hands before eating. Matthew and Mark describe what's clearly the same incident. The Pharisees and the scribes come and challenge Jesus about the fact that his disciples eat with unwashed hands. Now, this is the one where I'm just sort of allowing something in Luke that is probably a different incident to be cross-canceled here. So Luke would come out even, further otherwise. But as far as unique incidents, in Luke 11, Luke connects a concern about eating with unwashed hands to a time when a Pharisee invited Jesus to dinner and noticed that Jesus didn't ceremonially wash. So I think that might actually be a different incident from the one in Matthew and Mark. But if we want to talk about, who has a eating with unwashed hands incident, all 3 do, and it's the Pharisees in all 3. All right, not fasting like the disciples of John the Baptist. This is in all 3. Coming to Jesus, in one place it says that Matthew attributes it to the disciples of John the Baptist. So, if anything, Matthew's kind of slightly letting the Pharisees off the hook, that even though the disciples of John the Baptist mentioned that the Pharisees fast more than Jesus' disciples do, it's the disciples of John the Baptist who are actually saying it. I'm not putting anything heavy on that, but if it were the other way around, it would be, Matthew has the Pharisees asking the question itself, and this other gospel has, it's the disciples of John the Baptist who are actually asking the question, and in fact, Matthew that has the disciples of John the Baptist asking the question. But either way, all 3, triple tradition, mentions that the Pharisees fast and the disciples of John the Baptist fast more than the disciples of Jesus fast, and they're, criticizing Jesus for this. All right, two incidents that are completely unique to Luke, rules controversies. The woman bent over, the woman who couldn't stand up. It says that the synagogue official criticized the people for coming to be healed on the Sabbath. Now, it doesn't say that he was a Pharisee, but if anything, of course, synagogue Judaism developed greatly after 70. So you remember the thesis is supposed to be that Matthew, more than Luke, is emphasizing the power of the Pharisees because supposedly after 70, the Pharisees had more power because of the fall of the sacrifice system with the fall of Jerusalem. And of course, there would have been synagogue officials, okay, who would have been powerful at that time. I'm not saying that Luke is reading this back into the situation. I think it actually was a synagogue official and somebody told Luke this. But so it doesn't use the word Pharisees, but it uses the word synagogue official, which, if anything, would seem to fit the thesis even better, except inconveniently, it's in Luke, not in Matthew and not in John. All right, and then healing of the man with dropsy. This is the criticism of Jesus here is explicitly attributed to the Pharisees, and it actually occurs in the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. It's like a setup of Jesus, and that's unique to Luke. So, rules controversies. Luke has more by a bit than the others do. Rules controversies with the Pharisees, where the Pharisees are assuming the authority to criticize. All right. Now, John doesn't have any of these. I just went over this whole set of rules controversies, okay? None of those are in John. Not a single one. Well, that's not so surprising because John tends to have unique incidents, right? So it's not all that surprising that he doesn't have these. But it becomes striking when we're supposedly talking about a development thesis and engagement with Pharisaism driven by a situation in life, sometimes called by the German phrase Sitzleben, of John's audience, and he's trying to reflect that situation for the sake of his readers rather than the historical reality. Just let it kind of hit you. Not a single one of those rule controversies that I just gave you from the Synoptics are in John. There are two, count them two, rules controversies of this kind in John. They both have to do with allegedly breaking the Sabbath. One is in John 5. Jesus healed the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, and he also told him to take up his pallet and walk. So, two alleged violations of the Sabbath. First, work of healing on the Sabbath, and then second, telling the man to carry something. Interestingly, the word Pharisees is not used here. The more broad word, the Jews, is used here. I'm emphasizing this because in other places, Dr. Keener will really emphasize the exact word used. So he emphasizes in a thing I haven't read to you yet, I'll probably read it in a later video, that the word Sadducees doesn't occur in John. And that's supposed to be this big thing. Like John is replacing the Sadducees with the Pharisees, even though there's no evidence of such actual replacement going on. So, is this exact word Sadducees? So John refers to priests, many of whom were Sadducees, but he doesn't call them Sadducees, and we're making a big deal out of that. Well, here, John uses an even more inclusive word, namely Jews. Remember, in the one quotation we read, it said that John is more exclusively emphasizing the Pharisees, but here he's using an even larger word. Now that, of course, introduces the claim that John is more anti-Semitic than the other Gospels, but that's webbing off into a different question of supposed development, which I've addressed elsewhere. The point I'm making just here, though, is that it's a broader term. He's not zeroing in specifically on the Pharisees. So by that standard, I could have even not included this one at all in John 5 and said there's only one rules controversy with the Pharisees, but I'm going to allow it because I'm actually sure that there were Pharisees involved. I'm not questioning that. Okay, but by the standard where we're, camping on what exact word is used, the word Pharisees is used here, and he's certainly not exclusively zeroing in on the Pharisees. He's using that larger word. All right, John 9, the healing of the man born blind. Here it actually does refer to the Pharisees, and they, just kind of go on and on and on that Jesus is a sinner because he healed on the Sabbath, though there is actually a conflict among them. Some actually seem to think he's not maybe so bad because after all he did a miracle, but it's definitely emphasizing Pharisees who are angry, who they're bullying the man born blind, trying to get him to admit that Jesus is a sinner. And that's Pharisees. And that's it. There are no other controversies in John that I was able to find about violating the rules of the Pharisees or these traditions of men, Pharisaism that Jesus is supposedly violating. There's a far greater emphasis on that in the Synoptics. So, by that first measure, the thesis that Matthew engages Pharisaism more than Mark and Luke, and that John engages Pharisaism or even engages Pharisaism more exclusively than Matthew does, and more than, obviously it would have to be, if the first premise is right, more than Mark and Luke do. It's just false. It just isn't true. This is the kind of questioning we need to be doing when we run into a development thesis, especially one that attributes fact-changing to the authors, but I'd say even when it doesn't. Because I'm afraid you're going to find, when you get down to it, the gospel development theories are all bunk. Please come back next time. I'm Lydia McGrew.